arbitrary.
So to bring you into this story, I think that's a good example, but to bring you into this story, we read the Exodus story, and early on we played the game of the Exodus game where we were God, and we said, what's your plan to emancipate the Hebrews? And we came up with ideas ourselves that included things like rapture, or just kill the Egyptians and march out, or put a protective shield around them and let them march out without any kind of effect. But what we saw that God did is, even though he didn't need 10 plagues, he used 10 plagues to torture the Egyptians. He asked, it was a little confusing, because he comes in to Pharaoh and he says, Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, I don't know who Jehovah is, and I'm not letting the people go. And then he says, well, we need to go 3 days into the desert, right? Or God's going to kill us. And Pharaoh says, no, I'm not letting you go. And then there's the 10 plagues. And then he says, if you don't let my people go, I'm going to kill all the firstborn in the nation. And this is a country, a civilization that believes in polytheism, right? That believes that there's a bunch of gods. And what God says is, I'm Jehovah, and I'm the only true God. I'm the creator of everything. And he says, if you don't accept that, even though you've got 1,000 years of history, I'm just going to kill all your firstborn children. That sounds like bully behavior to me on the surface. That's where we ended last week. What's going on here? And do we today have the right understanding of who God is? Because our understanding of who God is will dictate how we behave. And we've had the Spanish Inquisition. I think I have a laser pointer. We have, thanks, John. We have the Crusades. We have the Spaniards who came into colonize America, all who used bully tactics to convert people to Christianity. Convert or die. Not exactly a choice. But that does seem to be the choice that God, on the surface, that God gave to Pharaoh. Right? What do we have on the next slide? I want to review, which we may have already done, this idea of monotheism as it relates to last week's class. And one of the things these are the sort of 3 ideas that I really want to drive home from the implications of monotheism. It's not just one God versus many gods. It is that if there's one creator of everything, there's only one divine being, then implied in that is that there is relationship in spirituality. In polytheism, there is no relationship with the gods other than some attempt to try and placate them, to try and get them to feel good about you or to consider you in their own behavior. But if there's only one God, then I owe that God my life, my very existence. And so gratitude becomes part of spirituality if monotheism is true. Morality becomes part of spirituality under monotheism. It doesn't exist under polytheism. Because if there's one God who created everything, then that God gets to set the rules. And all of a sudden there's a right and a wrong. All of a sudden there's a way that things must be done. And I used the example of kids and parents versus kids and adults living in a household, right? And finally, there's inherent relationship, right? The concept of love becomes part of And that was why it was so part of spirituality. And that was why it was so weird to have Moses go from, with Pharaoh, God of Israel said, let my people go, that they may celebrate with me. Exodus 5, verse 1. Pharaoh says no, and Moses turns around and says, we happened on the Elohim of the Hebrews, and we need to go 3 days' journey and offer sacrifices to him, because if we don't, he might strike us with pestilence or the sword. And it seems like, and I love what Mark said, it seems like Moses went completely off script. Like, who does he think he is? Like, let's just give this another try. Let's see if this resonates. But in fact, what I think was happening is he was trying to use vocabulary that Pharaoh would understand, right? But why now? Why introduce monotheism at the Exodus? This was the second part of the assignment, and I'm assuming that those of you who didn't do the first part of the assignment also didn't do the second part of the assignment, and so we'll just have to talk about this together as a class. But so start thinking about that. Why introduce monotheism at the Exodus? I mean, don't we have enough to do, God? We're trying to get 1 million Jews out of Egypt? I mean, seems like there's already a big enough task. This, in project management, we would say this is feature creep, right? We've already got a big project going on. We're going to get all the Egyptians, or we're going to get all the Hebrews out of slavery, out of Egypt. Why monotheism? What do you think?
This is the start of the Hebrews. This is the start of Israel.
Okay. It's the beginning of the nation of Israel, as opposed to the family of Jacob, who is renamed Israel, right?
And the Hebrews that live among people, generations, they've been more than enough. So there was influence.
Okay, I think that's a great point. So God's people had been living under a culture of polytheism for generations.
Well, I guess I'll take a stab at it. You've got a stage now. Well, first of all, there's this overall overreaching plan that God has. And that involves, all of a sudden you have a stage. You're going to, not only the Hebrews, but you're going to teach the world like that God is here. He's going to use that. So if you the Exodus, and you don't introduce monotheism, it's just going to be interpreted as their gods prevailed. This is the perfect stage, speaking out loud, practically, this is the perfect stage to step in and say, no, the one who's doing this is the woman. That's it. And then there's visible proof, there's transit, there's proof to these people. All these people are going to experience this.
Okay.
I'm thinking out loud, maybe this is the time. People are ready now. This is the time to do it. Because if it's just look at this miraculous thing that we took all the Hebrews out, then you haven't accomplished. No one still knows who Yahweh is.
Right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about this. I think that in order to get to this nexus, let's start with spiritual monotheism in the biblical timeline. This is the group of people, these are the events where monotheism was a thought or a rubric or a idea of how the divine, the spiritual worked, right? We have the creation, we have Adam and Eve. They spend time with God in the garden all the time. They take walks in the cool of the evening. We have the fall. There's a separation clearly between God and humanity. and in particular, this couple, Adam and Eve. We have Cain and Abel. Cain is struggling with trying to control himself with Abel, and God speaks to him and says, sin is crouching at your door. Then we have Noah and the flood. God gets disgusted and says, I'm just going to destroy everybody. I'm going to start over. But he protects Noah. And let me just say, Noah wasn't perfect. Okay? So this bully God somehow found grace and mercy to separate Noah from the rest of them, right? And then afterwards, we start a new civilization with a new group of humans, and they decide, they get a little arrogant, they want to build a tower to heaven. God comes down, he says, I have to separate them. He confuses their language. They no longer can speak to each other. They're no longer sharing ideas, and they come up with their own. And then you got Abraham gets called out, right? Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah. By the way, Abraham, in the Jewish teaching, they and this is not written in the scripture, so there's my disclaimer, but they believe that actually Abraham's father was called Terah. And they believe that because it says that Terah was going to Canaan. He was going exactly where Abraham was called to go. And it says he stopped in Haran and settled there. And do you remember what Terah did in Haran? He was a seller of idols. He ran a shop that sold idols. And in the Jewish tradition, again, tradition, they believe that before Abraham left, he knocked all the idols off the shelves and broke them and put the stick in the largest idol's hands as a sort of mockery of his father's work. But anyway, Abraham, then we get Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah, which, by the way, it's interesting. God did not come down and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness. If you read the scripture, it says God came down, the angels approached Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah because he heard the cries. He heard the cries of the people who were suffering. He wasn't responding to wickedness. He was responding to this cry that he heard of the people who were suffering. Then we have Hagar and Ishmael, Sarah and Isaac, Esau and Jacob, sons of Jacob and Joseph. See what I did there? I didn't say Jacob and Esau. I put the firstborn first. I did it on the second one too. You got the sons of Jacob and Joseph. Then we have 400 years in Egypt, and from a family to a nation, which I think Chris pointed out. And now we're in the midst of some enslavement and abuse of people. There's one. Go ahead. Yeah. I don't have an answer, but
the way we read it, monotheism there, then became polytheism, and now God is reintroducing the idea. So in creation, there's a relationship between Adam and Eve. Clearly, that's monotheism.
no, actually, that's man and wife, husband and wife.
God and Adam and Eve.
Okay, yeah, okay.
That there's no implication that Adam and Eve said, out of all the gods, you're the creator.
Right, you're the one.
The fall, the same story with Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, maybe after
Babel.
Became, but we know when you get to Abraham, now there's multiple gods. So some point between there, it changed from single to multiple, and then obviously multiple became the
Dominant.
So
Do you have a question?
the question is, I guess the answer itself is that God is introducing their
Reintroducing, right? And at this, and initially, it only seems to be an understood rubric, paradigm, understanding within the minds of this family. Right?
So say that one more time about those.
Up until you get to the flood, there doesn't seem to be any understanding of a polytheistic sort of nature of the spiritual realm. It was always monotheism. But after, somewhere in between Cain and Abel, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, there was this introduction. And perhaps it's what.
Probably was the Tower of Babel, because at that point, people were scattered and people could talk to
Right.
other people.
Right.
That lets the imagination go wild.
Right.
There is a problem in that we're only viewing this from scriptural content that we have been given. We do not know what people are doing.
Which is my next slide. Right. Which is my next slide.
Even Abraham's family had most of God.
So the Gilgamesh was written 2150 BC, right? And when you go and look at several Near Eastern texts, and the floods in there already.
Yep.
Okay.
So let me just say, what Denise is bringing up, the Gilgamesh, is this epic story of which has a creation story and a flood story. Today's class is going to be a bit of a mind bender by the time we get to the end of it, and I'm just going to tell you that right away. There are so many parallels between the way that Judaism expressed itself, the way that the flood story and the creation story, there are at least 14 creation stories that are recorded in history in Near Ancient, if you include also Far Eastern traditions with Chinese. They all have a lot of similar sort of mythologies, similar characters. The same is true about the flood story. There are probably 11 different flood stories, and some of them sort of mixed together. Let's not go there, but let's just note that these kinds of explanations, humanity has been struggling to say, where did we come from? What do we understand about our origins, about God, about our purpose, our meaning? These are the big questions, and there are other recorded things. But as far as monotheism is concerned, this is the biblical timeline, but there's something else going on outside of the biblical timeline, which is polytheism and its context. And this is probably the pinnacle of polytheism, the Egyptian civilization. You remember where I put that slide up last week? Mythology meets reality. And we have these gigantic temples and these amazing, we have hundreds of gods in the polytheistic pantheon, if you will, and every god has a name and they have a particular authority. It's not complete authority. Reviewing last week's class, but up till now, the prevalent idea of the divine within humanity was this Elohim. There are these powers in the heavens, and it's plural. And they're jockeying for power, and they don't care about humanity, and there's chaos as a consequence. And, the powers include the powers of the earth and the powers. I was not touching it, right? The power of electricity. There are so many powers that are at war with each other and creating conflict and chaos.
Demonstration.
Right, right. This was a demonstration of just that. Okay, so so in this particular moment in time, we have Egypt, which is the pinnacle of polytheistic civilization. And as I mentioned a couple of times during the course of this class, why isn't my computer coming back on, you suppose? Should I switch inputs? So the pyramids had existed for 1,000 years before we ever get to the Exodus story. And sometimes we get this confused idea that okay, my computer. What's that? That the Jews built the pyramids. Something's happening, or was. Yay! Right? And somewhere in here I have a text that I want somebody to read. But let's keep going and ask ourselves, so we have this place, this timeline where we know monotheism existed within the context of the scripture. And we also have this context where we know polytheism has thrived for at least a millennium, right? So it's on and it's not working, but it doesn't matter because I have, sure it doesn't matter.
Can I ask another question while you do that?
Yeah.
Why do you think monotheism?
Reintroduced?
Yeah, what? No, not as where in the scripture do you get the indication that God is introducing monotheism? Because when I read it, does he not say the God of the Hebrews?
Yeah.
Say, the God, he only says the God of the Hebrews. So that gives Pharaoh understands he's still monotheism. He's still polytheism.
Right.
It's not his God.
Except, and this is a point of confusion because I don't know how to say this word, but on Moses' first ask, he uses this unpronounceable Hebrew word that we translate Jehovah, right? And Jehovah is more than just eternal. It's more than just, we talk about, well, what does it mean, this idea of Jehovah, that it's eternal? And we talked about how that's not that's a anemic definition, because what eternal means is that somewhere on the timeline, throughout time, you've always been there. You're always there. There is no beginning, there is no end, you're always there. But really, if you look at the word itself and do some analysis, God didn't say, I'm always there. He said, I am. I was, am, and will be always at the same time. And we don't understand that. I'm not going to stand here and say, oh, let me teach you how to understand who God is, except to say that he's off the board, right? Except to say he doesn't play in this world. He is not limited by that. And that has been a theme throughout this story, starting at the bush, when God said, I am Jehovah, and that is my name as a memorial. And that was the verse that Archie almost didn't read. But we don't hear it in the English translations because we have translated it Lord in all caps. We've given it a title. But that is the word that Jehovah used even at the bush. And then in the first ask, when Moses comes to Pharaoh, he says, this Jehovah is the God of the Hebrews. And somehow, I believe it's implied that we don't. I believe that that Moses spent more than a sentence or two talking to Pharaoh about letting the people go. We have a sentence or two. The God of the Hebrews, Jehovah, has said, "Let my people go." That's what happened. But I believe that Pharaoh got the message. I believe that he understood what was going on there. And monotheism is a word that I'm using that really was a way of saying this Jehovah, this Yahweh, this this unpronounceable word, this God who's off the board. He is introducing himself, and then he does it afterwards, right? After Moses or Pharaoh says no, Moses goes back to God and he says, I told you never should have sent me. The Hebrews are mad at me. Pharaoh's not listening to me. What are you going to do about it? And God says, did I tell you I have a new name? It's Jehovah. It's Yahweh. And I'm going to make my name known. Who did we say last week when we looked at it? To Egypt. I'm going to make it known to Egypt. At the burning bush, he said, I am Jehovah, and that is my name as a memorial. To Pharaoh, he said, I am Jehovah. I am the Creator God. So his name is playing a pivotal role in this story that I don't know that I've ever focused on in my own study. And that's where I'm taking this idea of monotheism, because inherent in his name is this idea that he is the only one. And if you want to phrase it differently, that's okay. But that's what I believe God is trying to establish here. Now, somebody brought this up. I call this the right time argument, right? I mean, maybe the nexus between the Exodus and monotheism is it's just the right time, right? I mean, we can kill two birds with one stone. Did you get that pictogram there? Right? And I mean, the Hebrew people need to be freed. Humanity needs to understand about monotheism. Why not? Let's just do it. We'll do them both. I'm God. Right? Maybe. But maybe there's a strategic reason as well. Is it possible that there's a strategic reason and it's not just a right time argument? What do I have here in my notes? If Egypt could go from a polytheistic belief system, if Pharaoh could go from believing in polytheism to believing in monotheism, the greatest civilization in history, that certainly would make a mark, both then and for generations to come, right? I mean, this is definitely a good right time argument, but do you remember when we played the Exodus game and we played God? See if it works. Hey! Somebody hum the Star Wars theme. Your chosen people have been unfairly enslaved in Egypt. You need to free them and take them to the land of promise. Your opponent is the powerful, stubborn Pharaoh. And we played this game where I asked you for 3 ideas on how to get him free. Right? I said, what is your way to most quickly and efficiently get to the goal? And this is what we came up with. Right? I took every table's input, and we came up with the idea that you could kill the Egyptians, you'd have the Israelites leave, have a rebellion, blind or freeze the Egyptians, have a rapture, somebody came up with a clever idea of softening Pharaoh's heart. Then we looked at God's plan, or at least our understanding of God's plan. Ask Pharaoh nicely. If he doesn't agree, negotiate to a 3-day release. He definitely wants Pharaoh's permission for some reason. And if not, use the 10 plagues to inflict pain. And then, for some weird reason, harden Pharaoh's heart so he can't make the right decision, and then just kill all the firstborn. I mean, this is a weird story. I'm sorry, but at face value, this is a weird story. But what if there's a strategic reason for introducing God as the only God in this context? What if this is true? What if this plan, oh grief, I should have put God's plan over there. What if God's plan is the same as just introducing monotheism into the world? Making it known to the Hebrews, making it known to the Egyptians, making it known to the world. What if that accomplishes that task? How would that work? How do you think that would work? Any ideas how that might work? Do I have any ideas how that might work?
But I do see God's plan. Question is he introducing concept of himself to the Egyptians, or is he introducing them to the Israelites? Once they came out of they potentially bring their God with them. Something this.
Yeah.
They are Egyptians. Also, Jewish Egyptians.
Right.
Like, I may be considered
Yep.
really, I guess, an African American.
I don't think you would be considered an African American, but I understand the point that you're making. I guess you could be considered an African American coming out of Zimbabwe, but okay.
Which?
By the way, I filled out a form this week, and I was supposed to give my ethnicity, and there's a whole new group of things that says visually identifies as. So like you can visually identify as a white person, you can visually identify as a brown person. I'm like in the summer I visually identify as a brown person, and in the winter I visually identify. I don't know. Anyway, I get what you're. Ian is an African American. Not only probably not visually identifying as what most people think of as an African American, but definitely is, because he's an American and he was born in Africa. So we're going to give it to him, okay? And the way I like to relate it to the Exodus story is it was easy for God to get the Israelites out of Egypt. It was really difficult for God to get Egypt out of the Israelites. Ian's not done.
Yeah, you basically said it. But I have two cultures. Which culture is dominant? The Jews had two cultures. They had 400 years of being in Egypt.
Right.
What throws me is, how did they remain Jewish? 400 years. Something must have made them Jewish so they could be identified. And so they had two cultures. They had the culture they were living in and the culture who they are. When they move out, they still have that.
They're taking both.
They're taking both.
Yeah.
God has to try and get rid of one.
Right.
So maybe this is wider than we think, because yes, he's trying to introduce monotheism to Egypt, but possibly also to the wider world.
Right.
Because things in those days, things were orally transmitted. So you create this big story, this big event, it's going to be talked about.
Right.
And there's going to be oral transmission
Right.
outside of Egypt, because we already heard
Right.
that people had already heard these stories
Right.
of what they did.
Right.
So I think it wasn't just about Egypt.
Right, right. And that's, I think, yeah, monotheism to Egypt.
The purpose of the Jews was to tell the rest of the world about God.
But we're still talking about the right time argument, right? Still the right time argument, not the strategic argument. God's desire is to get the Israelites out of Egypt. We call it the Exodus story, right? But we're talking about God now converting the world through the story, and that's okay. It's a good time. I believe there's a strategic argument. If God could, in fact, convert Egypt to monotheism, get Pharaoh to accept monotheism, it would end this idea of might makes right. Let me show you what I mean. Let's back up and let me ask you a question. How did we get to where we are? Somebody read Exodus Exodus 1, verses 8 through 14. How did we get, when I say how do we get to where we are, how do we get to this nation of people who are enslaved? Exodus 1, 8 through 14. Good and loud.
Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us, and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them, to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for the Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and in all kinds of labor in the field, and all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them.
Thank you. So, a couple of things there. If you ever get a chance to go to Egypt, you want to see what Israel did, go visit Ramses, the ancient city of Ramses. They built that city. But I didn't know how to. So how do we get to decades of slavery? Somebody read Exodus 2 now, verses 23 through 25. It was torturous. Exodus 2, 23 through 25. Just a couple of verses there.
During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the people of Israel.
Now, this is a weird verse, but it's okay because it's a weird story. God remembered his covenant? Like, what, did he forget about it? Was he going through his stuff and went, oh, look at this contract I had with Abraham? But what actually caught God's attention? They're groaning. They're groaning. They're suffering. That reminded him that he needed to be faithful. Decades of slavery was going on. So now let me ask you this question. How is it possible for Pharaoh to enslave the Hebrews? And what I really mean is, he murdered and drowned their babies. We know this intellectually, but look at those pictures. Chuck them in the Nile. Just drown them. Put them in a bag with a rock. Throw them into the Nile. Just kill them as soon as they're born. Can you imagine what that would feel like for those mothers and those fathers? Somebody read Exodus 1, verses 15 through 22. And ask yourself, for those of you who aren't reading, how could Pharaoh rationalize this?
Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. If it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, and let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called to the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women. They are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive.
How do you suppose Pharaoh rationalized this? How is it that someone can be so wicked and sleep at night? What do you think? Come on. Don't you guys rationalize your own bad behavior?
There's no competition, right? You're eliminating the competition before it's
Okay.
And also in their religion, it might not be such a big deal. You know, I mean, guilt is something that we learn. It's something that we learn, and if that's not in their religion, then they don't have any guilt about it. And you know, child sacrifice has happened throughout history.
Great points. All of those are great points. I'll get back to that.
Okay, I'm not build on this one, but I think it's a lack of respect for human life, because Pharaoh is looking at the Egyptian people as his property.
Yep.
And just like we do in the cattle industry, what do? We eat the cows.
We do whatever we want with them.
We castrate the steers and we eat them.
Right.
It's controlling their herd.
Right. So this is what I came up with. For sake of time, we'll just go through it really quickly. He was king. He was king of the greatest civilization that the world had ever known. Right? He had a national interest to protect. That gets to the argument of no competition. He had things he had to do. And history wouldn't judge him. Why? Because history is written by the winners, right? And right now, he is sitting at the top. And he can do whatever he wants. But probably most important, he was an Elohim. He was a God. He was deity himself. And this is how they behave, right? We talked about this. You have all these gods in the heavenly realms, and they all have power. None of them has ultimate power, and they have conflicts with one another. And they don't care about humanity. Afterwards, Moses and Aaron came to him and said, Pharaoh, thus saith Jehovah, the Lord of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast in the wilderness. We've talked about this. And Pharaoh said, who is Jehovah, that I should hearken to his voice? And besides, I don't know him, and I'm not going to let him go. And then we get the second ask. I think Pharaoh understood the other agenda that was going on here. I think Pharaoh believed he was a god, and Jehovah had issued a challenge of power. This was now a new struggle between two Elohim. And Pharaoh's response was, and we don't have time to read this, take the straw away, but don't reduce their quota. I will show you who has power. I will respond to the challenge just the way his understanding of Elohim works. And as I said before, our behavior reflects the God we understand. And this was the God he understood, or the gods he understood. This is a chapter, or this is a page right out of the playbook of polytheism. Pharaoh was acting exactly the way he thought gods needed to act. Just like the Crusades. Just like the Spanish Inquisition. Just like maybe our interactions with other people sometimes. We reflect the God we understand. And here's a big issue. Yahweh has decided the strategic nexus between Exodus and monotheism is if I can defeat the idea of slavery, the idea that enslaves my people, if I can defeat that idea in people's minds, it'll just melt away. Didn't we say point number 2 of monotheism is if there's one creator, there's morality, right? And Denise said they didn't have guilt. How could he enslave those people, kill those babies? Because there was no morality. He could do whatever he wanted. But if there's morality, all of a sudden, not treating human beings with dignity and respect as part of God's creation, that becomes a problem with the God, right? And so if he could convert Pharaoh, he could free his people. And this is also an extremely important point. The Exodus story is not about God going against Pharaoh. It's not about God going against the Egyptians. It's about God going against the Elohim, the polyistic gods that are in the minds of humans at that time, so that he could establish himself as the God. What do I have next? If God's going to do this, it's going to be really, really hard, right? I mean, if he's really going to try and do this to a 1,000-year-old civilization, he's going to need a plan. And he's probably going to need a backup plan. And he might even need a backup plan for his backup plan. But love always hopes. Now I want to give you a few notes to close on. I believe that it was God's plan to convert Pharaoh. And you might say to me, well, how can that be? God knows all things. He knows Pharaoh's going to reject monotheism and therefore be rejecting him. So why is it that God would even try? Right? And my answer to you is, love always hopes. And God is love. Right? I told you Yahweh was key. It's been running throughout this story. It's this idea of God always being, God off the board, not limited by time and space. God just is. And I don't know what that means. And I don't know how it works. And in the past, sometimes when I've tried to understand God and the future and free choice, and I've struggled with these ideas, I've said to myself, God knows the future, but he may choose not to look. Well, I have come to understand that that's a bit of a sophomoric way of thinking. Like God not going to look? What does that even mean? God's going to hide the answer and fold up a piece of paper and he's seal it in an envelope and he's not going to get it out even though he's God and he knows everything all the time and he's eternal. And he's off the board. Trying to describe the Parker brothers when you're a playing piece in the Monopoly board, that's what we're trying to do here. And I believe that he may know the future, but it doesn't stop him from always hoping, from always loving humanity. And I can't explain this to you, but God is trying to do something here that we would never try, but we're asked to, which is hope in a hopeless situation. Love always hopes, and that's what God's doing. He is actually trying to convert Pharaoh, even though he knows Pharaoh's not going to respond. I don't know. I didn't coordinate with him at all, but I think it's a great point. I will close with this. I did put it up here. Maybe these two are in fact the same thing, and that's your assignment this week. How is it that introducing monotheism to Egypt and the Hebrews and the world is the same plan as asking Pharaoh nicely, negotiating for a 3-day release, obtaining Pharaoh's permission, using 10 plagues, and hardening? Well, we won't get to the hardening of the heart, but next week we'll talk about how this is in fact synonymous. And we'll talk about the plan and the backup plan and the backup to the backup plan. Well, we might not get there. And you'll have to wait another week before we get to this one. We're going to have to devote a full week to that. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I went over. We'll have some more fun next week.
Let's say, I can't see this.